An elderly woman is humiliated and thrown out of a cafe. No one speaks up. But when a quiet man stands, everything changes. What Keanu Reeves does next shocks everyone and teaches a lesson the world won't forget. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The snow drifted softly onto the busy sidewalks of New York City, coating everything in a thin, icy layer. Inside Whitaker's cafe, warmth and polished wood gleamed under soft yellow lights. Patrons chatted in low, contented voices, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of imported coffee. The scent of roasted beans and sweet pastries hung in the air like a comforting blanket. The door creaked open with a hesitant push. A cold gust followed the figure inside. Maddie Parker, 72 years old, stepped in slowly, clutching her worn handbag close to her chest. Her old wool coat hung heavily from her small frame, wet from melting snow. She paused just inside the doorway, trying not to draw attention. Her breathing was labored. The morning chill had not been kind to her weakened body. Her eyes, though tired, searched the room. She needed warmth. More urgently, she needed to take her medication. At the far end of the cafe, Keanu Reeves sat quietly by the window, a simple black wool cap pulled low over his brow. His face was mostly obscured behind dark sunglasses and the rim of his coffee cup. But he noticed her the moment she entered. He watched as people glanced up from their laptops and newspapers, their eyes flickering with silent judgment. Maddie took a small, steadying breath. She approached the counter where a young red-hailed waitress stood, wiping it down. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the back of the cafe where James Whitaker was already watching from his office doorway. After a moment of internal conflict, the waitress forced a polite smile and nodded. "Right this way, Mom," she said gently. "Thank you, child," Maddie replied, her voice soft but warm. The waitress guided her to a quiet corner, away from the main crowd. Maddie eased herself into the chair with effort. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her handbag, pulling out a small bottle of pills and a brown glass vial. Addison's disease didn't wait for convenience, and she was already feeling the familiar signs: lightheadedness, weakness in her limbs, the tight grip of exhaustion creeping in. The waitress returned with a cup of hot tea. Maddie whispered her gratitude. She carefully placed 2 white pills on a napkin and unscrewed the vial's cap with shaking hands. She had just lifted the cup to her lips when a shadow loomed over the table. James Whitaker. He was tall, dressed in an expensive suit that did little to hide the coldness in his eyes. His lips curled in a thin, unpleasant smile as he looked down at Maddie like she was something unclean. "We're not running a shelter here," he said quietly but firmly. "This isn't the place for loitering." Maddie set her cup down carefully. "I'm not loitering," she replied, her voice steady despite the sting in her chest. "I ordered tea. I'm taking my medicine." Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "We have an image to uphold." At his words, a few of the nearby patrons glanced over. Some looked away quickly. Others watched, unsure whether they were witnessing something important or simply another uncomfortable moment to ignore. By the window, Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. He remained seated, but didn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding. Whitaker leaned down closer to Maddie. "You're making my regulars uncomfortable," he whispered sharply. "Finish your drink and leave." Maddie's fingers clenched around the teacup. Her breath came shallow now. "I have a medical condition," she said, her voice cracking. "I just need a moment." Whitaker sneered. "You people always need something." The red-haired waitress returned, her expression uneasy. "Sir, she's not bothering anyone." "Get back to work," Whitaker snapped without looking at her. Maddie's hands shook violently now, but she still managed to slip one of the pills into her mouth and take a sip of tea to swallow it. She didn't meet Whitaker's gaze anymore. She stared down at the table instead, focusing on breathing through the humiliation burning in her chest. Keanu Reeves placed his coffee cup gently on the table. His fingers flexed once against the warm ceramic before he stood, moving quietly toward the corner. But Whitaker wasn't done yet. He grabbed the teacup from Maddie's hand. "I said finish," he growled, and dumped the hot liquid into the nearby potted plant, steam rising from the dark soil. The brown vial of medication tipped and rolled off the table, shattering on the polished wood floor. A sharp gasp escaped from Maddie's lips. She half rose, as if to retrieve the vial, but her legs gave out and she stumbled back into the chair. Whitaker stood over her, unrepentant. "Leave now, or I'll have you removed." The other staff members stood frozen in place. No one moved, no one spoke, until Keanu Reeves reached them. Without a word, he knelt down beside Maddie. He picked up the broken pieces of the vial with care, placing them on a napkin, before taking her hand in both of his. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice calm and grounding. "I've got you." Maddie blinked up at him in confusion, recognition slowly dawning. Whitaker took a step back. "Stay out of this," he warned. Keanu stood, his hand never leaving Maddie's. "No," he replied evenly, "I won't." And with that, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. "I think the world needs to see this," he said, starting a live stream. The cafe went dead silent. The cafe was still. The hum of soft conversation had vanished. Even the background jazz from the ceiling speakers seemed to fade, leaving an uncomfortable silence that hung heavy in the warm air. Maddie Parker sat in her chair, her back stiff with quiet dignity, though the color had drained from her face. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the table, one of them still trembling from the shock of losing her medication vial. Across the polished floor, the broken glass glinted faintly where Keanu Reeves had carefully placed it on a napkin. But James Whitaker wasn't finished. He approached again, his steps deliberate, each heel striking the wooden floor with a heavy finality. In his hand was a pristine white porcelain cup, steam curling lazily from its brim. His expression was carefully composed, but there was a gleam in his eye that betrayed a cruel sense of satisfaction. "We don't serve loiterers," Whitaker snapped. His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the silence. Maddie lifted her gaze slowly. She looked him in the eye, meeting his hostility with the quiet strength of a woman who had endured more than her share of battles. "I ordered tea," she replied softly, "and I paid for it." Her words were simple, factual, unapologetic. Whitaker's lips twisted in a humorless smile. "You paid for tea, not for sitting here turning my cafe into a spectacle." The red-hamed waitress, still hovering behind the counter, clenched her hands tightly around the dishcloth she had been using. Her knuckles whitened. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but a glance from Whitaker froze her. She lowered her eyes again and retreated to the espresso machine, her face pale. Whitaker's fingers tightened around the porcelain cup. Without a word of warning, he tipped it forward. A thin stream of hot water poured out, splashing onto the table near Maddie's hand. The liquid ran in rivulets across the surface and onto her lap, soaking into the fabric of her worn skirt. She flinched instinctively, jerking backward as the heat bit into her skin. Her handbag slid from her lap and tumbled to the floor. The remaining pills in her hand scattered, rolling in different directions before several were crushed beneath Whitaker's polished shoes. There was an audible gasp from a corner of the cafe. Someone dropped a spoon into their coffee, but no one stood up, no one intervened. Maddie sat frozen, staring at the water spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor. Her hands shook uncontrollably now. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather herself, to summon the strength to stand on her own. Whitaker straightened, handing the now empty cup to one of his servers without glancing at them. He turned back toward Maddie. "You've had your tea," he said coldly. "Time for you to leave." Maddie opened her mouth as if to protest, but no sound came out. He gave a sharp nod, and two burly men, his servers, both wearing crisp black shirts, stepped forward. They hesitated for only a moment, looking briefly at each other as if questioning the orders they'd just received. Then they obeyed. One of them grabbed Maddie's frail arm with a rough hand, hauling her halfway out of the chair. Her thin frame offered no resistance, her body wrenched forward with an audible crack from her shoulder. The other server took hold of her other arm. Together, they dragged her toward the door, her feet scraping against the polished floor, shoes squeaking softly. "No!" the red-hamed waitress whispered hoarsely under her breath, her hands flying to her mouth, but she didn't move from behind the counter. As they reached the entrance, Maddie lost her footing entirely. Her knees buckled. One of the men let go, and she crumpled to the ground with a muted cry of pain. Her hips struck the floor hard. She groaned softly, but did not cry out again. Her medication bottle, one she had retrieved earlier from her bag, rolled out from under her coat and was stepped on by one of the servers. There was a faint popping sound as it cracked beneath his weight, white pills spilling out and scattering across the floor like tiny bones. The door swung open with a sharp chime. Cold air rushed in, catching at Maddie's coat and her gray curls as she lay struggling to rise. That was the moment Keanu Reeves stood up. He did not move quickly. He rose slowly, deliberately, but his presence immediately drew every eye in the cafe, the quiet man from the window, the one who had been sipping coffee alone, unnoticed until now. He took 2 steps forward and stopped, standing between Maddie and Whitaker. The cafe went silent again. Keanu's expression was calm, his hands hung loosely at his sides, but there was a stillness about him that made the air thrum, like the moments before a lightning strike. "Stop," Keanu said. The 2 servers froze. Maddie lay still, her breathing shallow, trying to steady herself. Her eyes opened, searching the room in confusion. Whitaker folded his arms across his chest. "Stay out of this," he said harshly. "This is private property." She was trespassing. Keanu took another step forward. "She paid for her tea, she was sitting quietly, and then you assaulted her." His voice was low and even, but it carried to every corner of the room. Whitaker sneered. "This doesn't concern you." Keanu looked down at Maddie. He knelt beside her and gently placed a hand beneath her elbow, helping her into a sitting position. He took off his own scarf and wrapped it around her shoulders, shielding her from the cold air drifting through the open door. "It concerns everyone now," Keanu said quietly. He turned his head toward the crowd. Some of them looked down, others looked away. A few lifted their phones, cameras already recording. The red-hamed waitress took an unsteady breath and stepped out from behind the counter, moving toward Maddie with a clean cloth and a bottle of water. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen. "We're live," he announced, his tone soft but firm, "and the world's watching." The screen showed a live video. Keanu panned slowly across the cafe, showing Maddie, the spilled pills, the broken bottle, and Whitaker standing stiffly behind his servers. "You did this," Keanu said, addressing Whitaker directly. "You made a choice, and now you'll face the consequences." Whitaker's face darkened. "You think they'll care? This'll blow over. People forget." Keanu gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "Not today." And then, softly, as he helped Maddie to her feet, Keanu added, "Let's get you to a doctor, ma'am." Maddie, still trembling, managed a faint nod. She held on to Keanu's arm as he led her carefully toward the door, the red-haired waitress close behind. As they left, the phones kept recording, and outside, the snow continued to fall. Keanu Reeves knelt slowly beside Maddie Parker, his hands moving with deliberate care. His presence was calm, his movements gentle but filled with purpose, as if he had done this before, countless times in his own life when nobody was watching. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Let me help you." Maddie's breath shuddered in her chest. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she should trust the hand extended toward her. But there was something in Keanu's eyes, something steady, unwavering. She placed her hand in his, her fingers rough with age and the calluses of hard years. Keanu supported her weight easily, helping her sit upright first, then gradually easing her to her feet. As he did, he reached for her handbag, lifting it off the floor with the same reverence one might offer a precious object. He retrieved the crushed bottle of medication next, gently brushing away the broken pieces before placing it carefully into her purse. "You dropped this," he said quietly. "We'll get it replaced." Maddie's eyes glistened, but she managed a soft, "Thank you." The cafe was still, the silence palpable. Several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others watched, phones now aimed at the scene unfolding. The red-hamed waitress stepped forward timidly, handing Keanu a clean towel from behind the counter. He took it and draped it gently over Maddie's shoulders, shielding her from the cold air seeping in through the door. James Whitaker stood stiffly a few feet away, his face a mask of irritation and disbelief. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His ego bristled at being challenged, especially by someone so familiar to him and everyone else in the cafe. "This isn't your concern," Whitaker hissed. "You don't know what she's like." Keanu's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I know exactly what she's like," he said calmly. "She's someone who deserves respect." And then Keanu did something that made every single person in the cafe shift even more uncomfortably. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few swipes of his thumb, he opened his camera app and tapped a button. A red light blinked on. "We're live," Keanu announced, lifting the phone so that it captured Whitaker in clear focus. "This is James Whitaker," he continued, his tone still measured but carrying the weight of undeniable authority. "And this is how he treats a 72-year-old woman who just wanted to have her tea and take her medication." There was a gasp from one of the patrons near the window. Another customer stood up abruptly, pulling out her own phone and starting to record. Soon, 3, then 5, then nearly everyone seated in the cafe had their phones aimed at Whitaker and Keanu. The red-haired waitress, standing nearby with a hand over her heart, whispered, "Thank you." Whitaker's face flushed dark crimson. He took a step forward. "Turn it off," he barked, his voice cracking with panic. "This isn't your place to—" Keanu tilted his head slightly, still holding the phone steady with one hand. "You want to add salt to your problems?" he asked, his voice as soft as a whisper, but carrying an edge of steel. "I'd think carefully about that." Whitaker froze. He realized too late that the weight of every camera lens in the room was now on him, broadcasting his every move live to thousands, soon to be millions, on social media. His hands opened and closed twice as he struggled for control. Keanu turned back to Maddie, blocking Whitaker from view with his body. "We'll get you warm, ma'am," he said, "and we'll get you your medication." Maddie nodded slowly. I didn't want any trouble." "I know," Keanu replied, "but sometimes standing up is necessary, even when we shouldn't have to." The cafe door opened again, ushering in another gust of cold air and the sound of distant sirens. Outside, a few pedestrians had gathered, curious about the commotion inside. A woman in a thick coat peered through the window, her phone pressed close to the glass. The red-hammed waitress moved to the door and locked it, flipping the sign to closed. "Maybe that'll keep things calmer," she murmured. Whitaker, pale and sweating now, turned on his heel and stormed toward the back office, slamming the door behind him. No one followed him. Keanu pocketed his phone but left the live stream running, audio in his jacket. His focus remained on Maddie. "Let's get out of here," he said gently. "I have a driver waiting." Maddie clutched her purse tightly to her chest and gave a faint nod. As they walked slowly toward the door, patrons shifted out of the way. Some murmured apologies to Maddie as she passed, heads lowered in shame. Others offered her respectful nods. The older waitress, who had watched the entire scene with tear-filled eyes, placed a to-go cup of tea into Maddie's hands without a word. It was already sweetened. "Thank you," Maddie whispered. Keanu held the door open for her. The cold bit at his face, but he hardly noticed. He glanced back once, scanning the cafe. A few of the patrons remained seated, watching. Others were filing out. The red-hailed waitress stood by the counter, her arms crossed, a look of quiet defiance on her face now. Outside, Thomas, the ever-loyal chauffeur, stood beside a sleek black SUV. When he saw Keanu emerge with Maddie, he quickly opened the door and helped her in. offering a warm blanket and a bottle of water. Keanu followed, settling beside her. "I'll take care of this," he said quietly. "The live stream is already viral." Maddie sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. "I never wanted this kind of attention." "I know," Keanu said, "but the world needs to see, and they need to change." The SUV pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the snowy afternoon. Behind them, Whitaker's Cafe stood silent, its windows full of reflections and regrets. Inside the car, Keanu handed Maddie a small leather pouch. Inside were replacement pills for her Addison's disease. He'd already called ahead to a pharmacy and made arrangements. "You didn't have to," Maddie said softly, her voice trembling. "I know," Keanu replied with a quiet smile. "But I wanted to." She looked out the window, the city blurring past, and whispered, "Maybe there's hope after all." Keanu nodded. "There's always hope." And with that, they rode on. It started slowly, like a single match struck in darkness. Keanu Reeves' livestream had only been running for 7 minutes by the time they exited Whitaker's Cafe, but that was enough. Enough for tens of thousands of people to witness injustice in real time. Enough to ignite something much bigger than one man's pride or one woman's dignity. Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire. By the time Keanu helped Maddie Parker settle into the SUV's back seat and Thomas pulled away from the curb, the hashtag Justice for Maddie was trending on every major platform. Twitter exploded first, then Instagram. Then news outlets picked it up, replaying the footage with headlines that cut through the early evening fog like sirens. Hollywood icon exposes cafe owner's racism. Keanu Reeves stands up for 72-year-old woman at NYC cafe. Elderly woman humiliated, Keanu intervenes. Inside the vehicle, Keanu sat quietly beside Maddie. His long fingers closed the clasp on a simple leather pouch containing her new medication, an emergency refill from a pharmacy he had called personally. He handed it to her gently, placing it in her lap with care. "Here," he said softly, "it's all here." Maddie hesitated. She stared at the pouch for a moment, as if its weight carried more than just pills. She'd never asked for help, never expected it, not at this stage of her life. But something in Keanu's presence reassured her. He wasn't pitying her. He wasn't saving her to be a hero. He was simply kind. Her fingers closed around the pouch. "Thank you," she whispered. Then more firmly, with the grace of a woman who still held her dignity despite the day's events, "Thank you for seeing me." Keanu nodded. "We all need to be seen." They rode in silence for a few minutes, watching the city rush by. Snow continued falling in thin white ribbons, dusting the sidewalks and glimmering under the streetlights. But the world outside was changing, fast. By the time Thomas stopped in front of Maddie's modest apartment building in Harlem, there were already media vans lined up outside Whitaker's Cafe. Reporters with microphones scrambled to interview witnesses, customers, anyone who had been in the cafe that afternoon. The red-haired waitress, later identified as Emily Monroe, gave an emotional interview to a local news station. "I wanted to say something," she said tearfully, "but I was scared. I was wrong. I should have stood up sooner." Her video confession gained just as much traction as Keanu's livestream. By the time Maddie reached the lobby of her building, her story had become a movement. Inside her small apartment, the heat clicked softly from the ancient radiators. Keanu helped her remove her coat and scarf, hanging them over the back of a chair. He moved quietly, respectfully, letting her reclaim the space as her own. "Can I make you some tea?" he offered. Maddie smiled faintly. "I usually make it for myself." He nodded, stepping aside. She moved carefully through the tiny kitchen, placing the kettle on the stove, measuring out loose tea from a tin that had clearly seen better days. Her hands shook slightly, but her chin was high. Thomas stood in the hallway outside, speaking quietly into his earpiece. A small cluster of reporters had gathered near the building's entrance, but they kept their distance. For now. As Maddie poured the tea, Keanu sat at her table and checked his phone. The live stream was still pinned at the top of his feed, already watched by over 4 million people. The comments were relentless. Disgusting behavior. Shut Whitaker's down. Keanu Reeves is a legend, but Maddie is the true queen. Justice for Maddie now. I'll never spend a dime at Whitaker's cafe again. News anchors replayed the confrontation on every screen from Times Square to Tokyo. The footage of James Whitaker spilling hot water near Maddie, ordering his servers to drag her out, and Keanu's calm intervention played in endless loops. By the time night fully settled over the city, Whitaker's cafe had closed indefinitely. Protesters gathered outside its doors, holding handmade signs and candles. Some placed flowers on the sidewalk where Maddie had fallen. Others taped posters to the cafe's windows. Dignity has no color. Maddie's cafe, not Whitaker's. We stand with Maddie. Meanwhile, donations poured in through newly created GoFundMe pages. Though Keanu hadn't started them himself, he quietly verified the authenticity of one that promised to cover Maddie's medical expenses. Within hours, it surpassed its goal. Maddie stirred honey into her tea with slow, practiced movements. She watched Keanu over the rim of her cup. "I didn't want this," she said quietly. "I know," Keanu replied. "I didn't want attention," she continued, setting the cup down. "I wanted warmth, safety." Keanu nodded. "You deserve that. Everyone does." She sighed, glancing toward the window where snow still fell softly against the glass. "It's strange," she said. "I fought my whole life not to be seen as weak, and now people see me broken." "You're not broken," Keanu said gently. "They see you strong enough to stand through it." The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. "And you?" "I saw a woman taking care of herself," Keanu said, "until someone made it impossible." Maddie looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "I hope something good comes from this." "It already has," he assured her. "The truth came out, and now it can't be ignored." As the night deepened, Keanu and Thomas made sure Maddie was comfortable. They left quietly, promising to return in the morning. By the next day, Whitaker's cafe was closed permanently. James Whitaker himself issued a hollow apology in a press conference. Few believed him. His business license was under review, and lawsuits had begun. But Maddie's story continued. Keanu Reeves appeared on a morning talk show days later, not to promote a movie, but to talk about kindness, dignity, and the importance of standing up for others. "She didn't ask for help," he told the host, "but she deserved respect, and sometimes the world needs to be reminded." Justice for Maddie remained a trending topic for weeks. And Maddie, quietly, went about her life. She cared for her grandson Michael, who hugged her tightly every time she returned from the store. She taught him the importance of treating people with dignity. "I want to be like Mr. Reeves," Michael said once. Maddie smiled. "Be better." The television flickered softly in the corner of the living room, casting pale light over the modest furniture of Maddie Parker's apartment. News anchors spoke in urgent, respectful tones about the movement that had sprung up in the aftermath of her humiliation and Keanu Reeves's intervention. But Maddie wasn't watching the screen. She was watching her grandson. Michael sat on the worn couch beside her, legs crossed, eyes locked on the TV. His brow furrowed with emotion, his young face tight with the effort of holding back tears. Maddie placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, baby," she said gently. Michael turned toward her, his voice cracked, thick with emotion. "Grandma, you still stand tall." Maddie smiled. There was pride in his eyes, a fierce pride that reminded her of another time, another fight. Her fingers unconsciously drifted to the old photograph on the side table. Black and white, faded at the edges, but clear enough to see. A young Maddie Parker, 19 years old, standing on the steps of a courthouse in Selma, Alabama. A line of protesters behind her, handwritten signs demanding equality and justice. Her head high, her back straight, the same determination in her eyes that she carried today. She'd marched through streets lined with angry faces. She'd crossed bridges where others had fallen. She'd sat at lunch counters where people had spat at her. She'd spent nights in jail for daring to sit, to stand, to be. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but strong, "I was about your age when I first stood up." Michael looked at her, curiosity flickering behind the tears. "I wasn't much older," Maddie went on. "We marched because we had to. We marched because silence wasn't an option anymore." She gestured to the television, where images of protesters now gathering outside Whitaker's cafe filled the screen. Candles, signs, songs from another time, sung by a new generation. "It wasn't easy then. It isn't easy now," she said. "But we stand tall because others need to know it's possible." Michael wiped his eyes. "I'm proud of you." Maddie squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you too." A knock at the door broke the moment. Michael stood first, his instincts sharp despite his age. Maddie followed, slower but steady. She opened the door to find Keanu Reeves standing there, holding 2 brown paper bags in his arms. He smiled warmly. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Maddie smiled back, shaking her head. "Not at all." Keanu stepped inside, the bags rustling softly as he moved toward the kitchen. He wore a black wool coat, simple and unassuming, with a knit scarf around his neck. No entourage, no cameras, just a man bringing groceries to a woman who had stood tall when others had pushed her down. "I thought you might need a few things," he said as he unpacked cartons of milk, bread, fresh fruit, and vegetables. He set a small box of tea beside the kettle. "And the pharmacy said these were ready." He placed the new bottles of Maddie's medication on the table, lined up neatly, the labels clean and new. Maddie's breath caught for a moment. It wasn't the medication, it was the respect, the care. After everything, that mattered most. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Keanu met her eyes. "I wanted to." Michael stared at him, awe and admiration plain on his face. You're really him." Keanu chuckled, warm and genuine. "Some days, yes." They sat down at the small table, the 3 of them, over a simple dinner of stew and cornbread. Maddie had made the meal earlier in the day, long before the chaos had unfolded at Whitaker's cafe. The food had cooled, but the warmth remained. Keanu listened as Maddie told her story. She spoke of growing up in Alabama, of being the youngest daughter of sharecroppers who never finished school but insisted their children would, of sneaking books out of the white-only library because there was no other way to learn, of walking to school 5 miles each way because the buses didn't stop in her part of town. "I was stubborn," she admitted with a smile. "Still am." She told Keanu about the first march she joined, how her father had made her promise to come home safe, how she hadn't been able to, arrested for sitting at a counter and asking for coffee. "I wasn't trying to start trouble," she said, stirring her tea. "I just wanted to be treated like everyone else." Keanu nodded. "Some things shouldn't be so hard." She spoke of meeting her husband Elijah at a voter registration drive, of how they'd married under a magnolia tree because no church in town would take them, of moving north to New York, hoping for a better life, of raising their daughter Alicia, and later helping to raise Michael after Alicia passed away. "My husband used to say the road is long, but we walk it together." She glanced at Michael, who squeezed her hand in return. Keanu smiled softly. "He sounds like a wise man." "Who was?" Maddie agreed. As she spoke, the conversation drifted toward the present, toward the cafe, toward Whitaker and what had happened. Maddie's tone didn't waver. She spoke of it as fact, not bitterness. "I wasn't surprised," she said, "but I was tired." "Tired?" Keanu asked gently. "Tired of pretending it doesn't hurt," she answered. "Tired of keeping my head down. I've earned the right to sit, to breathe, to exist without fear." Keanu nodded slowly. "You have." Silence settled for a moment. Not uncomfortable, thoughtful. "I saw you," Keanu said finally. "Long before I stood up, I saw you." Maddie tilted her head, curious. "You sat with grace," Keanu continued, "even when they tried to take it from you." Maddie's throat tightened. She took a slow breath. "You stood with grace." Michael smiled wide, watching them both. They finished dinner, and Keanu helped wash the dishes. He moved with the easy familiarity of a man used to doing his own chores, his sleeves rolled up, his hands steady. Later, they sat again in the living room. Maddie told Michael stories of his mother as a child, and Keanu listened, adding the occasional joke that made them both laugh. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The world beyond the window was still in turmoil. Protests, news crews, debates on talk shows, hashtags and petitions. But inside that apartment, there was peace. Before leaving, Keanu stood in the doorway for a moment, his coat draped over one arm. "May I come back?" he asked. Maddie smiled, full and genuine. "Anytime," Michael added quickly. "We're making peach cobbler next time." Keanu chuckled. "I'll hold you to that." He stepped out into the night, Thomas waiting near the SUV. The door closed softly behind him. Inside, Maddie and Michael stood by the window, watching him walk away. "You think he's a hero?" Michael asked. Maddie's gaze stayed on the street below. "I think he's a good man," she said softly. "And that's better." She placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "But don't forget, baby, you can be one too." Michael nodded, the weight of the moment settling deep inside him. "And Maddie?" She smiled again, tired but strong, knowing the fight wasn't over. But neither was the hope. The morning after the video of Keanu Reeves and Maddie Parker went viral, Whitaker's Cafe opened its doors to an unfamiliar sight: an angry crowd standing just outside the velvet ropes. They weren't there for lattes. The normally pristine windows were now smeared with breath and fog, as protesters pressed hand-painted signs against the glass. Messages like "Dignity for Maddie" and "No place for hate" dominated the view. A young woman wearing a knit cap stood in front, chanting into a megaphone, "Shut it down." Inside, James Whitaker watched the growing crowd with disbelief. His face was pale, but anger simmered under the surface. He slammed his hand on the counter, startling his remaining employees. His two burly servers, who had just days ago dragged Maddie Parker from her seat, stood frozen near the doorway. "Where are all the customers?" James barked. One of them opened his mouth but said nothing. There weren't any. What once was a bustling cafe filled with regulars sipping $6 coffees was now nearly empty. Only two people lingered at the back, filming the chaos through their phones. They weren't there for the coffee. James wiped sweat from his forehead, pacing behind the counter. He'd issued an apology on social media the night before, a stiff, half-hearted statement filled with legal jargon. His PR consultant had drafted it, assuring him it would pacify the masses. It hadn't. In fact, it had made things worse. "Fake apology, shame on Whitaker," the protesters shouted in unison outside the cafe. The red-hand waitress, Emma, stood across the street from her former workplace. She clutched a microphone, flanked by local reporters. The Channel 8 News logo gleamed in the corner of the camera as the journalist pressed her for answers. "I worked there for 3 years," Emma said, her voice steady but emotional. "I saw things I shouldn't have ignored. But when he threw hot water at Maddie Parker, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore." Emma's voice cracked. "She's somebody's grandmother. She deserved respect." The reporter nodded solemnly, prompting Emma to continue. "James Whitaker has run that cafe with arrogance for years. He treated staff poorly, but this," she gestured toward the crowd, "this was different. This was evil." The crowd erupted in cheers. Emma wiped away a tear but stood tall, her voice clear despite the growing noise. Inside, James slammed his fists on the counter again, muttering curses under his breath. Minutes later, a different kind of visitor arrived. 2 health inspectors in navy jackets and official badges pushed open the cafe's glass door. Their expressions were grim. They didn't pause as they strode toward the kitchen, clipboards in hand. "Excuse me," James called, his voice tight. "We received multiple complaints." The lead inspector replied flatly. "Unsanitary conditions. We need to inspect the premises." "That's ridiculous," James protested, following them. This place is spotless." But within minutes, the inspectors were marking violations: a leaky refrigerator, expired milk cartons, and a hidden corner in the kitchen where grime had built up for years. The longer they looked, the worse it got. By noon, they taped a large red notice on the window: "Closed for Health Code 68." Aaron Robbins' movies also had. The crowd cheered. Cars honked in support as they drove by. Whitaker's Cafe, once the pride of its neighborhood, was shuttered in disgrace. As James stared through the window at the mess he had created, his phone buzzed with new emails. One after another. Terminated vendor contracts, his coffee supplier refusing further business, a formal lawsuit filed on behalf of Maddie Parker, supported by civil rights organizations. And as if that wasn't enough, news stations played clips of Maddie Parker's interviews on an endless loop. "I never wanted trouble," Maddie told reporters from the porch of her small apartment. She sat on a wicker chair, Michael standing proudly behind her. "I just wanted to drink my tea, take my medication, and warm up for a few minutes." Her voice was calm, dignified, but carried an undeniable strength. "I faced worse, but no one should be treated that way, not in this day and age." When asked how she felt about Keanu Reeves stepping in, she smiled. "He didn't have to do anything, but he chose to stand up, and I'll always be grateful for that." The camera cut to Keanu standing quietly beside her, smiling humbly. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "That's all." The video spread across the country like wildfire. Talk show hosts praised Maddie's resilience. Celebrities posted under "Justice for Maddie," sharing her story and calling for change. And then, something unexpected happened. Keanu launched a fundraiser in Maddie's name. At first, it was a small GoFundMe page with the modest goal of replacing her medication costs and covering medical expenses. Within hours, the donations surpassed $50,000. By the end of the first week, it had reached over $1 million. Keanu made an emotional video thanking donors, sharing Maddie's story with millions of followers. "She marched for justice in the 60s," Keanu said. "She stood up for what was right. Now, it's our turn to stand for her." He pledged to match the first $100,000 personally, ensuring that Maddie never worried about medical bills again. The extra funds went into a trust, supporting Maddie's family and funding scholarships for young Black students in the community. But Keanu didn't stop there. He worked quietly behind the scenes with community leaders to organize a panel on racial discrimination in public spaces. He met with city officials to discuss stronger protections for elderly citizens facing discrimination. And in the middle of it all, Maddie Parker became a voice for change again. Standing at the podium of a town hall meeting, Maddie spoke with grace and power. "No one's too small to make a difference," she said. "Kindness costs nothing. Dignity should never be a privilege." Michael stood beside her, holding her hand. Later, Maddie received invitations to speak at universities. Her story inspired discussions on justice and compassion in schools and churches across the country. Meanwhile, James Whitaker's life continued to unravel. The lawsuit filed on Maddie's behalf moved swiftly. Video evidence, eyewitness testimony, including Emma and the older waitress, painted a damning picture. Civil rights lawyers representing Maddie argued the case passionately, while Whitaker's own legal team struggled to salvage what remained of his reputation. Settlements were negotiated, compensation was awarded, but no amount of money could repair the damage to Whitaker's name. The cafe never reopened. Whitaker himself was last seen leaving town, his business lost, his arrogance deflated. And yet, the story didn't end in anger or revenge. It ended with hope. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community center funded by the fundraiser, Maddie stood proudly as Keanu handed her the ceremonial scissors. The center would offer free meals, medical aid, and counseling to elderly citizens in need. On the wall, a plaque read, "In honor of Maddie Parker, dignity for all." Keanu stood beside her, quiet and respectful. He didn't need recognition. He simply wanted to do what was right. As the community gathered to celebrate, Maddie spoke one last time. "We are stronger together," she said. "We are seen, we are heard, and we are loved." The crowd erupted in applause, and somewhere in that crowd, Michael smiled, his eyes filled with pride for his grandmother, the woman who had stood tall through it all. The television studio lights were bright, but Maddie Parker sat calmly in the plush chair across from the host, her back straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. At 72, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that silenced even the most distracted viewers. The camera's red light blinked on. Millions of eyes turned to her. "This is Maddie Parker," the anchor introduced, "a woman whose story captured hearts around the world." Maddie smiled gently, nodding. Her grandson Michael sat nearby, off camera, watching her closely. He gave her an encouraging thumbs up, his dark brown eyes wide with pride. The set was quiet, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Maddie adjusted the simple silver necklace that had belonged to her mother, then glanced toward the camera lens as if peering through it, directly into the hearts of those watching at home. "It's never too late to stand up," Maddie said. Her voice, though soft, was steady and clear. "Not just for yourself, but for others who can't, for those who feel invisible, for those who feel tired. You are not alone." The interviewer nodded, clearly moved. "Maddie, people across the country are calling you a hero." Maddie chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm just a woman who needed a warm place to sit and take my medicine. But I suppose when you stand up for yourself, you stand up for everyone who needs to." A photo of Maddie at 22 flashed on the screen, her younger self marching for civil rights in Selma, arm linked with fellow protesters, her gaze fierce and unflinching. The interviewer mentioned her past activism, and Maddie gave a small nod. "Some things you never forget," Maddie said, "and sometimes life circles back to remind you that the work isn't finished." The interview lasted 20 minutes, but it was the final line that stayed with people long after the credits rolled. "Compassion," Maddie said, "is a choice. Choose it." Later that evening, Keanu Reeves sat on a quiet park bench in Central Park. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and a pair of sunglasses perched on his nose, but anyone who walked by might have recognized him anyway. His small rescue dog rested at his feet. He watched Maddie's interview on his phone. He didn't react much, just a small, warm smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. When Maddie spoke about compassion being a choice, he nodded slowly to himself. "She gets it," he whispered to the dog. "She always did." A few minutes later, he tucked the phone away and stood, brushing crumbs from his jeans. There was somewhere he needed to be. Maddie hadn't expected to volunteer at her age. Her joints ached when it rained, and her Addison's disease sometimes left her fatigued. But every time she walked through the front door of the new community center, a wave of energy returned to her. "Maddie's House of Hope," read the sign in elegant gold lettering above the door. At first, she'd protested the name. She didn't want to be the center of attention, she'd said. But the board insisted. The community had insisted. "You stood up for all of us," they told her. "Let us stand up for you." The center served hot meals, provided free counseling, and ran workshops for seniors and young people alike. Michael helped in the afternoons after school, tutoring kids in reading and math. Maddie led a support group for elderly people who felt isolated or lonely. She read stories to children at the community library every Tuesday. One evening, as she was organizing the pantry, Emma, the red-haired waitress from Whitaker's Cafe, walked in holding a stack of canned goods. "I still don't know how you stay so graceful," Emma said, placing the cans on the shelf. Maddie smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's practice, and a little help from my mother's lessons." Emma chuckled. "Well, we're all learning from you now." Later that night, as Maddie was locking up, the receptionist handed her a plain white envelope. "No return address," she said, but it came with a note. Maddie opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a check made out to Maddie's House of Hope for $100,000. The note attached was short, handwritten in careful block letters. "Thank you for showing us how to be better. A friend." She smiled softly. She had her suspicions. The next day, she called Keanu. "You didn't have to do that," Maddie told him over the phone. "I know," Keanu replied, But I wanted to. They spoke for a few more minutes, sharing small updates about life. Keanu promised to stop by soon. When he did, the kids at the center swarmed him, asking for help with bike repairs and tips on drawing. Keanu laughed softly, obliging each one. Maddie watched from the doorway, shaking her head fondly. Later, Michael sat on the front steps beside her, drinking iced tea. "Grandma," he said, "do you think things will really change?" Maddie looked out at the street. It was dusk, the streetlights starting to flicker on. Cars passed slowly. A few people waved at them from across the street. She took a slow sip of her tea. "I think," she said, "they already have." Michael leaned his head against her shoulder. For a long time they sat like that, watching the world move gently around them. And inside Maddie's house of hope, people found warmth, dignity, and second chances, just as Maddie had always dreamed. It had been nearly 6 months since that bitter cold day in Whitaker's cafe, but today the sun shone brightly over New York City. Spring had come early, and so had the celebration. Maddie Parker stood at the entrance of the newly renovated building, her fingers lightly brushing over the engraved brass sign that read, "Maddie's House of Hope." It gleamed in the morning light, much like the hope that had returned to her life and the lives of so many who crossed its threshold. For a woman who had spent much of her life advocating quietly in the background, it still felt strange to be at the center of attention. But today, Maddie embraced it. "Grandma," Michael said beside her, tugging gently at her sleeve, "they're ready for you." Maddie took a deep breath and nodded. She adjusted her light blue scarf, one Keanu had given her weeks ago, and walked through the open glass doors. Inside, the community center bustled with life, volunteers unloading boxes, children playing quietly in reading nooks, and a kitchen crew preparing meals for an afternoon gathering. Near the kitchen, Keanu Reeves stood wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair tied back in a casual knot. He was ladling soup into bowls, sharing smiles and warm words with each person he served. He looked completely at home. As Maddie walked over, Keanu caught sight of her and smiled warmly. "You ready for your speech?" he asked. Maddie chuckled, shaking her head. "At my age, I figure I've earned the right to skip speeches." "But you also earned the right to be heard," Keanu replied softly. Before she could answer, a young girl tugged on Maddie's hand. "Are you famous?" the girl asked innocently, staring up at her with wide brown eyes. Maddie bent down so she was eye level with the child. "Only for standing up when it matters," she said kindly. The girl tilted her head in curiosity, as if deciding what that meant. Then she grinned and hugged Maddie's waist before running back toward a group of children painting in the corner. Keanu chuckled under his breath. "Looks like you've got a fan club." Maddie rolled her eyes, but a soft flush of color touched her cheeks. "Better late than never," she replied. And the red-hand waitress from Whitaker's cafe, Emma, approached, carrying a tray of fresh fruit. She wore an apron that read "Maddie's House, Volunteer." Her face had brightened over the months. Gone was the timid server afraid of losing her job. In her place stood a confident young woman eager to help. "Ms. Maddie," Emma said warmly, "we've got the last batch of groceries ready to go for the seniors." "Thank you, dear," Maddie said. "And I hope you're still planning to teach that baking class next week." Emma smiled and nodded. "Every Tuesday." Michael joined them with a clipboard in hand. "Grandma, we have a local journalist here who'd love to interview you." Maddie glanced over her shoulder and sighed. "Tell them I'll answer questions, but only if they stay for dinner." Michael laughed and walked off to relay the message. Keanu stepped beside Maddie, his gaze catching something just outside the front window. Maddie followed his line of sight. Across the street, a newly opened cafe stood with a large painted sign above its windows. In elegant, looping letters it read, "Maddie's Place, everyone welcome." The former Whitaker's Cafe had been purchased and rebranded by a group of community investors after James Whitaker lost everything. It was now a space of inclusion, warmth, and welcome, a complete transformation. Maddie's eyes welled with tears, not out of sadness, but something deeper. Fulfillment. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" she asked Keanu quietly. Keanu tilted his head and thought about it. "I think it started with a cup of tea." Maddie gave a short laugh and nodded. "I suppose it did." He smiled. "And then, a lot of people who refused to look away." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for not looking away." Keanu's expression softened even more. "You made it impossible to." They stood in silence for a moment, watching through the window as customers of all backgrounds sat together at Maddie's place, laughing, sharing coffee, and being welcomed with kindness. Back inside the community center, the children had finished painting a mural on the far wall. Maddie's house had given them all the tools and supplies, but the design had been their own idea. Maddie turned toward it now, taking in the image. It showed a tall tree with sprawling branches. In the tree's roots were faces, elders and ancestors whose strength supported the new growth above. In the branches were children playing, birds flying, and books resting in little carved-out nooks. At the center of the trunk was a figure, Maddie herself, arms open wide, with a serene smile on her face. At the bottom of the mural were painted words, "Hope grows here." Maddie's throat tightened, but she cleared it gently and turned back toward Keanu. "You were right," she said softly. "About what?" he asked. "This is bigger than me." He nodded. "You made it so." As the afternoon sun poured through the windows, the community gathered in the hall for a shared meal. Maddie sat with Keanu, Michael, Emma, and the other volunteers at the head table. They laughed, swapped stories, and shared plates of cornbread and stew. It wasn't fame or fortune that defined her life now. It was connection. It was legacy. And it was love. As evening approached, Keanu stood and offered to help clean up. Michael snapped a photo of Maddie watching Keanu gather dishes. "That'll look good in the newsletter," Michael teased. "Better him than me," Maddie joked back. Later, as Keanu slipped out quietly to avoid drawing attention, Maddie saw him pause by the front steps. He touched the Maddie's House of Hope plaque lightly, then gave a small nod before walking away into the New York twilight. Maddie stood at the doorway, her hand raised in farewell. She knew he wasn't leaving, not really. He was part of this home now as much as anyone. And as the door closed behind her, the mural glowed softly under the lights, a lasting reminder that one act of courage could plant the seeds for a future no one could have imagined. As the lights dimmed inside Maddie's House of Hope that evening, something hung in the air. Something intangible but deeply felt. It wasn't just the warmth from a hearty meal or the laughter that echoed through its hallways. It was the understanding that lives had changed. Not just Maddie's, not just Keanu Reeves's, but everyone who bore witness to the day dignity was defended and justice was demanded. Maddie Parker had lived 72 years, and in all those years she had known struggle. As a young girl growing up during the civil rights movement, she had learned to carry herself with pride, even in the face of those who tried to make her feel small. As a mother and later a grandmother, she had passed those lessons down. Quiet strength, unwavering dignity, and kindness that never wavered. But on that cold day in Whitaker's cafe, something happened that neither she nor anyone else could have anticipated. In that moment, as she lay humiliated on a cafe floor with her crushed medication scattered around her, a man stepped forward. Not because he was famous, not because he wanted to be seen, but because, deep down, Keanu Reeves understood the truth. Courage doesn't need an audience. Compassion doesn't require applause. Keanu didn't act out of duty. He didn't act because the cameras were rolling. He acted because it was the right thing to do. And so, in the days that followed, the world watched as a simple moment between a grandmother and an actor sparked something much greater. The video of James Whitaker's cruelty and Keanu's gentle, unwavering defense spread like wildfire. But more important than the millions of views was the ripple effect it created. People began having conversations they had long avoided, conversations about dignity, about justice, about the silent battles people fight every day when no one is looking. Maddie's story reminded everyone that the world isn't changed by grand speeches or elaborate gestures. It's changed by the quiet moments when someone chooses to stand up rather than stay seated. It's changed by those who see injustice and decide they will not remain silent. Keanu Reeves could have walked out of that cafe unnoticed. He could have ignored Maddie's struggle and finished his coffee like it wasn't his concern. But he chose differently. He chose to stand beside her. He chose to lift her up. Not because it made him look good, but because it made the world a little better. And Maddie? Maddie chose to keep standing. She chose to share her story, not from a place of bitterness, but from hope. She chose to open her home, her heart, and eventually her community center to others who needed a reminder that they mattered. The truth is, Maddie had always stood tall, but now, thanks to Keanu's simple act of compassion, the world finally saw her. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. True courage is standing tall, even when the world tries to knock you down. It's refusing to be defined by someone else's cruelty. It's holding on to your dignity when others try to strip it away. And it's using your strength not to seek revenge, but to offer hope. Keanu Reeves didn't use his fame to seek attention. He used it to shine a light on injustice. He used his voice not to talk over others, but to amplify a woman who had lived a lifetime of courage and grace. Maddie's strength inspired a movement that began in a small cafe and grew into a community, a movement that restored faith in human decency and reminded us all that kindness costs nothing, but dignity is priceless. As Maddie once said in her interview, "It's never too late to stand up, for yourself, for others." That's what makes her story and Keanu's actions so powerful. Because it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being human. And if there's one thing we can all take away from this incredible story, it's this: compassion changes the world, one act at a time. So, if you believe that courage and kindness have the power to make a difference, we invite you to join us on this journey. Hit that like button. Share this incredible story with someone who needs a reminder that hope is still alive. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that prove ordinary people, just like Maddie and just like you, can make an extraordinary impact. Because when we choose to stand together, when we refuse to look away from those in need, we create a world where everyone is seen, valued, and loved. And in the end, it's not about fame or fortune. It's about respect, it's about dignity, and it's about choosing to be the kind of person who makes someone else's world a little brighter. So remember, kindness is free, dignity is priceless. And as Maddie Parker and Keanu Reeves have shown us, when we live by that truth, we leave behind a legacy of hope that echoes far beyond anything we could have imagined.